Now we'll start our unit on evolution. Evolution is change over time. This is just going to be a really brief introduction. We're not going to go super in depth. So if you're really interested in evolution, you can come talk to me and we can talk about it more in depth and how it works. Evolution is going to bring together everything that we've already studied, how all living things are made up of the same stuff, those nucleotides that make up DNA, and the mutations in reproduction that can happen, and the proteins that we make from that DNA code. So it's really bringing together everything that we've already studied. So you guys have probably heard the name Charles Darwin because he is considered the father of evolution. So Darwin lived from 1809 to 1875. This is important because his time period is what really allowed him to make the observations that he made. So he lived during the height of the British colonial period, meaning that there were lots of ships going all around the world because they were looking for new land to colonize and places to trade with. And it was also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is important because humans began to greatly change the environment because we started pumping huge amounts of pollution and soot into the environment. And that's what allowed Darwin to make some of his observations. So before we talk about Darwin, let's talk about what came before Darwin. What did Darwin have to work with? The first theory of evolution was put forth by Lamarck. Lamarck's theory was called inheritance of acquired traits, and this was believed for a really long time. Inheritance of acquired traits means that if an organism works really, really hard at something its entire life, that it can pass that trait onto its child. For example, if a person works on being tan their whole life, then their baby will be tan because they were tan. If a giraffe works to stretch out its neck to have a longer neck, then his babies will have a longer neck. If a man works out and is super buff and has huge muscles, well, then his baby will automatically be super buff and have huge muscles. Now, we know that this isn't how it works, okay? That those are environmental factors. If you want big muscles, you have to work out. Doesn't automatically guarantee that you're going to have a muscly baby, okay? Same thing with the tan. Dyeing your hair blonde is not going to make you have a blonde baby if you don't have the genes for being blonde, okay? But people believed this for a really long time. Also, before Darwin, we had a scientist named Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell is known as the father of geology. His theories on how the earth was formed really, really helped Darwin when Darwin made his journey and saw some of the things that he saw. So what Charles Lyell gave us was a theory on the formation of sedimentary rock. Hopefully you guys can remember back to your middle school science. Remember that sedimentary rock is rock that is formed over a long period of time due to great pressure. And it's made up basically of sediment that has been pressurized into rock. So, because of Charles Lyell and knowing how sedimentary rock is formed, that older stuff is on the bottom and then new stuff gets washed on top and then that gets pressed down and turns into rock and then new stuff gets washed on top of that and pressed down and turned into rock. They were able to say, oh, well, since the older stuff is on the bottom, that must mean that fossils found lower down are older than the fossils on top. So what this allowed scientists of the time to do is to have a little bit of a time scale for the fossils that they found. And goes, oh, well, this fossil, nothing like it exists today, but now we have an idea of what lived before or after something else. So we started to get our first evolutionary timeline due to Charles Lyell and the formation of sedimentary rock. Okay. Same idea of the older stuff being on bottom. Think if you got a new magazine every single week and you stack the magazine in the corner, okay? Let's do every month. That'll be easier. So you take January's, you read it, you stick it in the corner. Then in February, you read it, you stick it on top of January. Okay? So that means after the whole year has gone by, the newest magazine, December, is going to be on the top. And the oldest magazine, January, is going to be on the bottom. That's the same way that sedimentary rock forms. The older stuff is on the bottom because the new stuff gets tossed on top. Okay, so let's get back to Charles Darwin. When he was 22 years old, he joined an expedition aboard what was known as the HMS Beagle. The goal was to map the coast of South America to look for people to trade with and find new resources. Now, his family was a well-to-do family. They weren't fishermen, they weren't travelers, they were scholars. So when he told his family, I'm going to go on this 5-year expedition aboard the HMS Beagle, they were like, are you insane? Do you even know what a boat is? We don't do that in this family. We're scholars. We study things in books. We don't go tromping around the world. You could die of scurvy or something. But he didn't listen to his family, and he joined the crew anyway as a naturalist. So his job was to observe and to collect specimens. Okay. So here's a map. Remember, it's a globe. So where this line begins and where this line ends is actually the exact same point. So they actually went all the way around. Okay, so they started up here, came down, visited all along the coast of South America here, as was their goal. And then here's those fateful Galapagos Islands where he made all of his really major observations that helped him solidify. And then they went around, okay, same place, and hit a couple of spots here. Oh, hit the tip of Africa, back over, and then back home. Okay, so 5 years, and they traveled all around the world. So Charles Darwin's theory of evolution has 4 premises. He says these 4 things must be true for evolution to occur. You need to know these and in the proper order because one builds upon the previous ones. Okay, so they build on each other. Okay, so I'm going to go into them and I'll start by giving the actual language he used, and then I will dumb it down to like one little tiny phrase to help you remember it. Okay, so premise number 1 is that members of a population have heritable variations. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that in a population there is diversity, so they're different from one another, and that diversity is inheritable, so they're passing them on in genes. Okay. Now let's remind ourselves, where do we get variation? Okay, remember that we get variation from genetic mutations, which are random, and from sexual reproduction. So crossing over during meiosis to create egg and sperm, as well as independent assortment, and then fertilization, the bringing together. So all of that's within sexual reproduction. Okay? And lots of things can cause a change in a gene over time. Remember those mutagens. Okay, so let's remind ourselves about mutations. They could be good, which is rare, but if it's a good mutation, it stays around, and we call it an adaptation. Whether something is an adaptation or not just depends on whether it was helpful or not. A mutation could be bad, which means that individual is probably going to die off, or it could be neutral. It could just mean different, like blue eyes in humans. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad, it was just different. Example of a good mutation in humans would be the ability to digest milk. So all you milk digesters, you're mutants, but you're good mutants because it made you healthier. Okay? So, here's your definition for adaptation. It is simply a structure, a function, or a behavior that enables species to survive. In humans, a structural example would be the opposable thumb, function, be able to digest milk, or a behavior. So some of our hunting behaviors early on enabled us to survive. Okay? These structural adaptations, such as the thumb or very large brains, may take millions of years to develop. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the rate of mutation. So how quickly does the DNA mutate to allow for these chance good ones to come along? Also, the rate of reproduction. The faster an organism reproduces, the more chances for more mutations to occur. And also environmental factors. What is the environment like? What happens to be helpful for an organism, or what's bad for an organism? A lot depends on the environment. Okay, back to Darwin. So premise number 1, variation, and that variation is inheritable. Premise number 2, more individuals are produced than can survive. So those that are surviving are competing for food and shelter and struggling to survive. So premise number 2 is there is competition. Okay, you're competing for food, you're competing for water, you're competing for shelter, you're competing for mates. There's competition. And not every single baby born survives. Think about the octopus. In one single egg laying, a female will lay 80,000 eggs. How many of those grow up to reproduce themselves? 50 if she's lucky. So there's competition amongst individuals. Premise number 3. Some individuals have adaptations that enable them to survive and reproduce better than others. This is known as survival of the fittest, okay? So premise 1, there's variation in the population. Premise 2, there is competition amongst those variations. Premise 3, some of those variations are gonna compete better. Okay, so you see how these premises are building on one another? Number 3 puts together 1 and 2. Okay, there's competition amongst the variation, and some are better competitors. Look at this picture. There's 2 moths. Which one is going to survive better? This one. He blends in, right? So he's going to be harder to find. He's going to live longer, and he's going to make more babies. This one stands out like a sore thumb. A bird's going to see it, and it's going to get eaten. It is not going to survive very long. So this guy is more fit for his environment, okay? It depends on the environment. What is fit for the environment? Being fit doesn't necessarily mean having the biggest muscles or running the fastest. Sometimes it does, but not always, okay? Premise 4, an increasing number of individuals in succeeding generations have these adaptive characteristics. Boiled down to, we call this natural selection. So over time, as those variations compete, and as some of those variations compete better, those that compete better are going to have more babies. They're going to pass those genes on to more offspring. So over time, you're going to see that trait more and more and more in that environment. Okay? So natural selection, bringing it all together. Before the Industrial Revolution, these moths, they're called peppered moths, were mostly white because birch trees have white bark. After the Industrial Revolution, when we pumped all that soot into the environment, it settled on the trees became dark brown and black. So the few that were dark brown or black started to survive better. So they started making more babies. So now the peppered moth population is mostly brown or black rather than white. It was a change over time. So Darwin described his theory in what he called a long essay, but it's a big old book called On the Origin of Species. Okay? All right, that's all we need to know for today. If you have any questions about those 4 premises or you don't understand how they come together, please, please, please call me over and let's talk about it one-on-one.